the world of politics to the world of business. This is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
Vladimir Putin arrives in North Korea, his first visit there in 24 years, to acquire weapons to use against Ukraine as part of a new strategic partnership with Pyongyang. We'll discuss with Deputy National Security Advisor Daleep Singh.
And we'll be joined by Republican Senator Shelley Moore Capito of West Virginia about her drive to boost the use of nuclear energy in the U.S. and the GOP's call for a generational increase in defense spending.
Tomorrow is Juneteenth. We'll talk about the historical significance of the holiday and how black voters are viewing the election now with Democratic Congressman Jonathan Jackson of Illinois. Thanks for joining us on the Tuesday edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons, and Russian President Vladimir Putin is visiting North Korea this week, his first trip there in 24 years. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre referenced it in today's press briefing.
We don't believe any country should give Mr. Putin a platform to promote the war of aggression that we are obviously currently seeing in Ukraine. And Russia, we believe, is blatantly violating the UN Charter and working to undermine the international system.
It's where we start our conversation now from the White House North Lawn with Daleep Singh, White House Deputy National Security Advisor. It's great to have you back with us, sir, on Bloomberg TV and radio. With this trip in mind and the prospect now of a new strategic partnership between Russia and North Korea, can the U.S. make shells and missiles fast enough to keep up with the supply that's coming from North Korea when we consider the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, good to be with you, Joe. I mean, no question about it. But look, let's step back and remember what happened last week. Something historic happened at the G7. We found a way to make Russia pay for Ukraine's defense. And that's never happened before in history. You've never seen a multilateral coalition freeze the sovereign assets of an aggressor country and then harness the value of those assets to fund the fight for freedom of the aggrieved party. That's what the G7 did last week. And we did so while maintaining our solidarity, while respecting the rule of law. And look, I think it sends a message to Putin, regardless of whether he's partnering with North Korea or any other country, the time is not on his side. We're not going to fatigue. He's not going to outlast us. And I'll say one more thing. I think it's a testament to President Biden's belief that multilateralism is a force multiplier. We harnessed $50 billion from these frozen Russian assets. We could not have done that alone.
Well, and of course, it wasn't just that move on those frozen assets that came out of the G7. It also included increased sanctions on a number of entities, some of them within the People's Republic of China. But so long as China still exists as a potential partner for Russia or North Korea, for that matter, how effective can Western sanctions really be?
Well, you're right, Kaylee. Russia has transformed its entire economy into a war machine, and China's become the factory to that war machine. So in addition to harnessing the value of the assets that we froze, we also announced last week a meaningful, I would say the most meaningful tightening of our sanctions regime against Russia in over 2 years. And we said any foreign bank, anywhere in the world that does business with Russia is going to be subject to our sanctions regime, whether that's in China, Central Asia, the Caucasus, North Korea, anywhere else. And so now these banks in third countries, including China's, have to make a choice. Either you continue to facilitate the procurement of Russia's war machine, or you get cut off from the Western financial system.
Of course, the sanctions you're pursuing are part of the reason why Russia has fallen into the arms of North Korea. Daleep, is there anything that you can do in this sanctions regime, including secondary sanctions that could cut off that supply?
Well, that's exactly what we announced last week. We used to have what are called primary sanctions. So we had, hundreds of Russian businesses, banks and non-banks that were on our sanctions list. Now we're saying if any bank anywhere in the world does business with those sanctions entities, you're also cut off from doing business with the U.S. And when it comes to North Korea, the technology they're providing to Russia's war machine, I don't think anybody would say that that's a substitute for the cutting-edge technology that Russia used to enjoy from the West. They're simply not a substitute.
Obviously, Daleep, all of these developments come while there is an active hot war being fought on the European continent. But there also is the question of what precedent is set by them, even if it does come in extreme circumstances. Not only having these secondary sanctions on what could be defined in some ways as private actors, but also in terms of the frozen assets being used, as you said, to fund Ukraine's war effort. How valid are the concerns about the idea that this actually could impact the way investments are made into third-party countries in the future?
They're completely invalid. We took this action respecting every jurisdiction's rule of law. We also took this action with the world's major issuers of reserve currencies. 90% of the world's reserve currency holdings were issued by countries that joined with us in taking this action. Think about the counterfactual. If we didn't take this action to fund Ukraine's continued fight for its freedom, and we allowed it to lose this war because it was insufficiently financed, and allow one of the most egregious violations of international law in recent history to go unchecked, think of the uncertainties that would unleash, the chilling effects it would cause, the signal it would send to autocrats all over the world. Those are the costs that we should all find unacceptable.
With all of this said, Daleep, Russia still has an economy that is functioning in a way that no one predicted a couple of years ago when it first invaded Ukraine and sanctions started to fall on Russia. Can sanctions in this new regime help to move the needle to win this war?
Well, sanctions never work as a standalone strategy. They work as part of a broader effort with our military support for Ukraine, our efforts to cut off Russian energy exports from the rest of the world, and a diplomatic strategy to isolate Russia. That's how they create staying power for Ukraine, and that's how we give Ukraine leverage at the negotiating table. But they are having an effect. I think what Putin has done to create a rebound in the Russian economy is to sacrifice his long-term growth potential. That's what capital controls do. That's what weaponizing your energy supply does. And that's what ramping up government spending to fund the war machine will do. Look at their inflation levels. Look at their central bank policy rate. These are nosebleed inflation and interest rate levels that are going to choke off growth in Russia for a generation to come.
Well, Daleep, you've referenced a few times in this conversation the idea that the U.S. is taking this action together with partners, including partners in Europe. With that in mind, how concerned are you about the domestic political developments we have seen in Europe in recent weeks? The growth of far-right parties in European Parliament, the call for a snap election in France. Is the U.S. going to be able to count to the same extent on Europe as a reliable partner in this effort?
Well, I think the likely outcome is the center is going to hold in Europe. And look, that's one of the reasons why the action we took last week was so important. What we've now done is created a mechanism that's going to generate a financial lifeline for Ukraine to the tune of $50 billion. That's going to be available regardless of what happens in the elections in Europe, in the United States, or anywhere else for that matter. And that's what delivers the message to Putin that time is not on his side and he's not going to outlast the West.
All right, Daleep Singh, White House Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economics. Thank you so much joining us from a very hot White House North Lawn this evening. We appreciate it. Now, still ahead, Republican Senator Shelley Moore Capito of West Virginia will join us live from Capitol Hill. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Of all the climate-related work I'm doing, I'd say the one that has the most bipartisan energy behind it is actually this nuclear work. If we unleash the innovation power of this country, we tend to lead. And I feel great about the support we're getting from the federal government in this nuclear space.
That was Bill Gates on Face the Nation this past Sunday talking about the future of nuclear energy and his own investment in it. Joining us now to talk about this and some other issues, Republican Senator Shelley Moore Capito of West Virginia, who has introduced the ADVANCE Act, which has passed the House and is expected to see a vote in the Senate later. The bill would boost growth and use of nuclear energy here in the U.S. And Senator, we welcome you back to Bloomberg TV and radio. It's great to have you with us. This country's had a bit of an allergy toward nuclear power, going back to 3 Mile Island, more recently what we saw in Fukushima. Are the new demands from data centers and AI, new demands for power on our grid, enough to increase the appetite here in the U.S. to start making new ones?
Well, I think you pose a great question, and I think that the answer is yes. We need an all-of-the-above energy plan that provides not just for the growing energy needs that we see right now, but also for the future, whether that's data centers or AI or, you know, a more electrification of whatever, vehicles and others. And so nuclear power, I think, provides a great opportunity here. There are different technologies coming on, small modular nuclear reactors that are much smaller, they're much more compact, they operate on different systems, and that's what the ADVANCE Act that we're going to be voting on today, that I've sponsored and moved over the last year to make sure that we have the technology, the licensing, and the innovation that we need to capitalize on nuclear power. And I'm really excited about this for every state, for my state of West Virginia, because it's going to help us with transitioning some of our power plants that were coal-fired power plants that are no longer in service, but they have the transmission, so we can put small nuclear there and be able to power the nation as we always have.
So, Senator, does one supplant the other? Does nuclear power's gain automatically become coal's loss? How does this play at home?
Absolutely not. I would not be advocating for anything that would supplant coal or natural gas. I think you have to look at it exponentially. When you look at what the predictions are for the demands on the grid over the next 10, 20 years, and remember, these nuclear plants, before they could come online, are going to be probably 4, 5, and 6 years into the future. We're going to need all of this. The wind can't blow anymore, and the sun can't shine anymore. And I think that we know that the base load demands that we're going to have for our own national security, for our own economic security, we need nuclear to be a part of this. And that's what I think these small reactors will provide.
I want to ask you about some economic issues, Senator, following Donald Trump's visit to Washington last week, his first trip to the Capitol, as we know, since January 6th. And it wasn't only lawmakers he was talking to, it was also members of the business community. And his ideas to put an across-the-board 10% global tariff on goods has been floated as a way to offset the cost of tax cuts. It's something that we talked about earlier today here on Bloomberg with Mick Mulvaney, the former acting White House chief of staff in the Trump administration. Here's what he thought about this proposal.
On the tariff plan for taxes, that one I don't put any credence in at all. The idea of raising tariffs to get rid of the income tax, that was a throwaway line. It takes you. I've talked to the policy people inside the Trump policy team. None of them have mentioned that. It's a cycle into disaster.
Yeah.
So math doesn't work on tariffs replacing income taxes.
I don't want to make you do any math here this evening, Senator, but I wonder if you support making the Trump tax cuts permanent, how should you pay for them?
Well, I absolutely do. Am in favor of making the Trump tax cuts permanent. I voted for them eight years ago, and I believe that they, at the time and even now, provided not just tax relief for every American, but helped businesses to grow, helped capital investments to incur, and helped our own economy. And we saw this really pre-COVID. COVID obviously threw a kink into the growth that we were seeing that was resulting from these policies specifically. And so they're all set to expire. The death tax the same way, which harms our farmers and other small business owners. And so I think we need to move forward with this tax relief. I think that traditionally over in the Senate, we haven't really paid for tax relief in that we have provided the growth that's provided by tax relief is there to pay for that tax relief. On the tariff issue, here's my concerns there. Every time you place a tariff on a good, and I think we've obviously had steel tariffs that I've supported and aluminum and others that I'm very supportive of because of the uneven trade practices. but you're driving the cost of goods up in our own country if we do something like a blanket tariff. So we'll have to see what President Trump will say when he's elected and what kind of policies he'll put forward. But he's going to find a supporter for his tax cuts in me and I think many other senators.
Well, Senator, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget suggests that if those were to be made permanent, it would add $4 trillion to the deficit. And just today, we've learned from the Congressional Budget Office that their estimate for the deficit this year has gone up 27% to almost $2 trillion. As we talk about potentially lower revenue, at the same time, I know that there are colleagues of yours on the Senate Appropriations Committee pursuing an idea of, say, increased spending on defense, and no one wants to touch Social Security and Medicare. How is all of this logistically supposed to work together?
Well, we don't have a revenue problem as much as we have a spending problem. And that does come with Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid absolutely driving this. What I think that takes is a moment in history and in time that we saw in the 1980s with President Reagan, where we sit down at the table and not just create a commission to have suggestions, but we actually look at ways for the long term we can preserve those very valuable programs, and we can also preserve them for the long term. That absolutely needs to occur, and it hasn't. It has not occurred. So, but it's going to have to, because you see as the projections of the trust funds are projected to go under in 10 years or so, whatever the latest projections are. In terms of the deficit, what was announced today, the $1.9 trillion deficit, which is $400 billion more than was originally predicted in February. Well, almost all of that extra $400 billion is because the president alleviated student debt. That was not a congressional prerogative. It is deeply rejected, I think, in my state as an inequitable way to move forward. And so I think that, you have to have policies that cut the spending, but also rein in the spending that you're obligated to do. And so I think we can do that, but we have to do it bipartisan, and that's where the difficulty lies.
All right, Republican Senator Shelley Moore Capito of West Virginia joining us from Capitol Hill this evening. Thank you so much. Now, speaking of President Biden, this afternoon he announced a new path to citizenship for hundreds of thousands of immigrants to the U.S., specifically those who came into the country illegally but have been here for 10 years or more and are married to U.S. citizens. Joining us now with more is Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson. So, Wendy, of course, this follows a prior executive action we saw him take when it came to asylum seekers, effectively shutting the border to them because numbers are too high. Is this supposed to offset that for progressives and Latinos that he wants support from?
In a word, yes. This is the counterweight to that. And it's, he got a lot of blowback from, as you said, progressives, the left-leaning Democrats, from Latino groups, from pro-immigration groups, about shutting the border down or the asylum claims down. And remember, he did that because Congress failed to pass this bipartisan immigration law, which there was majorities in favor of, and it looked like it was going to pass, and then Donald Trump shut it down by telling Republicans to vote against it. So Biden was left with nothing but executive action. The problem with both of these proposals, both limiting asylum claims and letting spouses stay in the country until they can get their papers, is that if Trump wins, they're gone. These actions are gone. I mean, Trump will undoubtedly take them off the books, and immigrants are back to where they were, and the border is back to where it was.
But there's not going to be a legislative answer, right? We've learned that.
Seriously doubt.
It's not going to likely emerge in the lame duck session. Right. So this is the new way to get to it, right? Joe Biden is going to try to please progressive Democrats, didn't like the last executive order, by putting another layer on here. Is this the modern approach to comprehensive immigration reform?
It really isn't. In fact, it echoes a lot of what President Obama did in 2012 when he created DACA, the Dreamers Act. He did that in 2012 in the midst of what didn't turn out to be tight, but appeared at the time, a tight re-election race against Mitt Romney. So he wanted to do something, to help immigrants. I think one thing that's left out there that isn't sure is whether this really bolsters the Latino vote or not. Because once you've become a citizen, once you're voting, the economy becomes your top issue. And in our polling shows that the economy remains the number one issue. Immigration is less than half of that in the polling as a top issue, but it is the second most important issue.
All right, Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson, we thank you for joining us on an important story here. Meantime, the outgoing CEO of Boeing was on Capitol Hill today, back in Washington, where he faced heavy scrutiny by lawmakers. David Calhoun testified before Senate Homeland Security Subcommittee about recent mishaps at the plane maker, and Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall was there and joins us now with more on this long-awaited appearance. Tyler?
Yeah, hey, Joe. So outgoing Boeing CEO David Calhoun actually stopped and talked to us reporters before heading into the hearing. And he told us he was on Capitol Hill for 3 reasons. The first was to answer questions, then to provide transparency, and lastly, to take responsibility. In a more emotional moment during the hearing, he actually paused his testimony, stood up and turned around to address the families of Boeing crash victims before then going on and resuming the hearing. He went on to say that Boeing is working to provide protections for whistleblowers from retaliation, as well as to address what has been called culture issues at the company, all while facing a grilling from lawmakers, particularly about the root causes of some of the recent safety mishaps. Here was part of his testimony earlier today.
Much has been said about Boeing's culture. We've heard those concerns loud and clear. Our culture is far from perfect, but we are taking action and we are making progress. We understand the gravity, and we're committed to moving forward with transparency and accountability.
But not everyone was convinced. I was catching up with senators as they were going in and out of the hearing. I want you to take a listen here to Senator Roger Marshall, a Republican from Kansas, then followed by Senator LaFonza Butler, a Democrat from California. 2 lawmakers on totally separate sides of the aisle, but both telling me that they were unsatisfied with Calhoun's answers today. They then go on to say that they will be seeking more answers from Calhoun. Joe and Kaylee, as you both know, Calhoun has been leading the company since 2020. But after that 737 MAX jet door plug incident in January, he said that he would step down. Recently, there has been an ongoing search for his replacement. Joe and Kaylee, sources familiar with the process tell Bloomberg News that that process is ramping up.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall on Capitol Hill this evening. Thank you so much. Now, the chair of the House Freedom Caucus, Bob Good, is facing a tough challenge as Virginia Republican voters head to the polls for their primary today. Good lost the support of Donald Trump and has faced a ton of negative ads. We want to have more on this now with Bloomberg Opinion's Nia Malika Henderson, who is joining us here in studio. So, Nia, obviously it's Bob Good versus John McGuire. John McGuire has the backing not just of Donald Trump, but a lot of others. What happens if Good goes down tonight?
Well, listen, Donald Trump is going to get his guy in John McGuire. He has been telling voters in Virginia that Bob Good will stab them in the back, just like he stabbed Donald Trump in the back. There's been about $10 million that's been spent on this race. You have in John McGuire, who is essentially running along with Donald Trump. Kevin McCarthy is backing him, too. Kevin McCarthy is backing him because he voted to oust Kevin McCarthy. So you've had lots of Republicans taking sort of the short bus, the short ride, I should say, to Virginia to stump for John McGuire. That is a race that everyone is looking at. Donald Trump wants to see Bob Good, who, of course, is the chairman of the House Freedom Caucus.
But so, to your point, so does Kevin McCarthy. So is this just retribution tour here, or is Donald Trump now aligning closer with the establishment on?
No. This is just retribution. I mean, it's about getting even. And it's something that Donald Trump talks about often. He wants to take this guy down because, as he said, he feels like this guy stabbed him in the back because he endorsed DeSantis. And so we will see what happens out of this race.
And, of course, it's not just Bob Good. There's also a primary in Oklahoma, the appropriations chair, Tom Cole. It seems, though, he's in a bit more of a secure position this evening.
Donald Trump is backing him. He's in a much, I think, more secure position. But he's got another candidate there who is also kind of challenging him from the right. But it's good that Donald Trump, as well as Karl Rove, is also supporting him. So I think
primary season that keeps giving here.
Exactly.
Remarkable. Bloomberg Opinions. Nia Malika Henderson, always a great pleasure to have you at the table. Thank you for the insights on this primary day. Coming up, Democratic Congressman Jonathan Jackson of Illinois joins the program. It's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
we want to make sure that it's clear. That is, that as a society and a country, that we recognize what had gone wrong and that we move to do the right thing in the right direction. It's amazing how the impact of slavery economically hit so many different places in so many different ways in our country. And eliminating that awful scourge was something that moved us forward and unified us even greater as a nation.
That was Hillary Shelton, NAACP National Advisor for Governance and Policy, earlier today on Bloomberg on the significance of Juneteenth, the holiday commemorating the end of slavery, which will be celebrated across the country tomorrow. Joining us now is Democratic Congressman Jonathan Jackson from Illinois, joining us from our Chicago bureau this evening on Bloomberg TV and radio. Congressman, thank you so much for being with us. Of course, it's been 159 years since Juneteenth. A lot of progress has been made in that time. Certainly more progress still has been made just in the last 60. As we look ahead to what comes after this Juneteenth, how much progress do we have still to go?
Oh, quite a bit. Unfortunately, there's some of the same vestiges that had initially been a problem in America had not been redressed or resolved. If you think of 159 years later from Juneteenth of 1865, we also have to think of 1619 to 1865, 246 years of the absolute institution of slavery, of Americans being kidnapped, robbed, raped, being denied the opportunity for education. It was a horrible period in our history. And so from 1865, if you will, up until 1896, there was the Reconstruction period. And there we saw progress, people moving forward. And then the winds turned backwards after the Justice Taney decision and the separate but of the laws of Plessy versus Ferguson, where there was the segregation that went into place. It took 58 years up until 1954 to overturn those black codes, those Jim Crow laws, and inch by inch it moved forward until we saw the culmination of an African-American president and that of President Barack Obama. But now we see some of those same forces moving the hands of time backwards when we see the restriction on voting right access, when we see the banning of African-American books in Florida, when we see the challenges to the voting laws. So America takes two steps forward. Sometimes it takes a step backwards, but there's an ongoing quest for freedom to move forward and have progress.
Well, Congressman, I want to ask you about what steps were taken here in this campaign cycle that we're in right now, because as you know, there is a massive effort by both the Biden campaign and now the Trump campaign to seize on the black vote. It may well make the difference in this campaign. It's going to be awfully close. And this past weekend, Donald Trump spoke at a campaign event roundtable in Detroit, of course, the key state of Michigan here. And he said this on the impact that he's had on the lives of black Americans. Let's listen.
We've done more for, and I say this, I say it proudly, more for the black population than any president since Abraham Lincoln. That's a big statement. And Crooked Joe Biden has done nothing for you except talk. It's only talk. It's all talk.
Congressman Jackson, how would you respond to Donald Trump?
Well, I wish we could have finished the clip and maybe he could have given some details and brought to light what he's done. I'm not quite sure what he was talking about. Oftentimes he can say things that aren't challenged and certainly aren't substantiated. And he certainly cannot compare his record for achievements and improvements.
Well, he says he will win the black vote in this campaign. Do you believe him?
No, I don't. And I don't think many people should believe him from courts, and other people should not believe what he's saying. But if you think about it, so if you think about when he says he's delivered more to the African American community, President Joe Biden nominated and had put in place for the United States Supreme Court the first woman of color, the first African American woman, and Ketanji Brown Jackson. President Trump didn't do that. President Joe Biden has had more African Americans in his cabinet than anyone else in American history. President Trump did not do that. So there are many things that President Trump has claiming and extolling that simply just aren't true. So I would appreciate if people in the media would challenge him. So what exactly that he's done? What he has done is he's called countries in Africa S-hole countries. What he has done is 35 years ago when I was a teenager, lied and asked for the death penalty on 5 teenage African-American boys and still said they're guilty even after the courts have found them innocent, and doesn't have the temerity or the guts or the compassion to even ask for their apology after those men had spent that time in jail. I mean, so I'm not exactly sure, and I would like for him to respond to it. It was Congresswoman Alma Adams of North Carolina that had introduced and passed the legislation for increased funding for historically black colleges and universities. So yes, I would like for him to expound upon what he's done for the African American community.
Well, what would you say, not to us in the media who ask questions of Donald Trump or his policies, but to black voters who are actually telling pollsters, or at least indicating that they aren't enthusiastic about voting for Joe Biden? What would you tell them about why they should?
Well, I would say that elections have consequences, and we may not get everything that we want in one candidate, but measure the cost. And I would tell people to measure twice and cut once. What's on the line is the Supreme Court. This next president can have the opportunity to appoint 2 United States Supreme Court justices. These laws live for centuries that we have to still challenge and still work through. If you think of what's on the line, is that President Trump in office has been very, very reckless. When you start closing the doors on Muslims and saying that they cannot come here, when you start turning your back on Haiti, when you start calling African countries out of their name, that is very, very mean-spirited. When you look and see what he's done in his early part of his career in housing in the city of New York, in Queens, where he fought against having African Americans to be renters. I mean, has he ever contracted and worked with African Americans? Even on his television show of The Apprentice, African Americans that were qualified were disqualified because he was seeking polls. So poll ratings and approval, as opposed to having character and the gumption and the will to do what was right. So I've not seen him stand up to the face of those persons that have tried to be vile and offensive to African Americans. I've not seen him to be a leader in any of these categories. So as it relates to the African American polls, there's a lot of conversations going on. I applaud Trump for going into the church. I don't know why he was, who sent the invitation. I don't know how many people he had there that were actors, but I don't see that groundswell for him receiving overwhelming support in the African-American community.
Congressman, I apologize. We're almost out of time, but I want to get to an important matter we talked about last time you were here. The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act is not about to get a vote, it seems, in Congress once again, but the Farm Bill is something you're working on right now. Is that the next best opportunity that you have as a legislator to help people of color when it comes to food stamps, the SNAP program?
Well, absolutely. And I would tell you that by pure numerical purposes, that there are more whites that are beneficiaries of food stamps than African Americans. If you look at SNAP, the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, 42 million Americans rely upon it, and that's for $2 per meal. Where can you get a meal for $2? And it's absolutely supplemental nutrition. So there is malnourishment growing in the United States of America. If we don't have it, you're talking about 18 million people that are falling further into malnourishment. And what is the cost of that? That comes up in Medicaid, Medicare, that comes up in brain development, that comes up in life expectancy. So we absolutely have to fully fund the SNAP program.
We'll continue this conversation in Chicago, Congressman. We'll be there for the convention and appreciate your time today. Congressman Jonathan Jackson,
Thank you.
The Democrat from Illinois. Thank you, sir. Coming up, my conversation from earlier today with Dave McCormick, Republican candidate for Pennsylvania Senate, U.S. Senate. From Pennsylvania, the former CEO of Bridgewater. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thanks for joining us. Earlier today, Bloomberg's Shelley Bosick and I spoke with Republican Dave McCormick, the former CEO of Bridgewater, about his current run for the U.S. Senate in Pennsylvania. He's been endorsed by Donald Trump. And we started by asking him about inflation and Trump's proposal to pay for tax cuts with tariffs. Here's a piece of that conversation.
Listen, I was someone who has been generally skeptical of tariffs. But when President Trump came into office, I thought that selective use of tariffs to ensure a fair playing field, ensure reciprocity, ensure negotiating leverage made sense. And so I supported the tariffs that President Trump put in place under the last administration. And I do think that there's the risk of inflationary impact. And frankly, I think there's two dimensions of President Biden's policies which are relevant to this. One is the enormous spending is the primary driver of inflation. That and the policies that are directed on reducing oil and gas consumption. Those are the primary drivers of inflation. And economists like Larry Summers have said as much. The second problem with those policies of the Biden administration, particularly as it relates to EVs and solar panels and so forth, the policies that have been in place have made us, ironically, highly dependent on China because 70% of the lithium batteries and 80% of the solar panels are manufactured in China. So in one fell swoop, in my opinion, the Biden administration's economic agenda has driven up inflation and made us more dependent on our primary adversary. And that's why, as I've run for the Senate, I've advocated a set of policies that take us in the opposite direction.
Let's put a finer point on this, Dave. The idea of tariffs here against China we'll put aside for a second because Donald Trump is also proposing an across-the-board, a global 10% tariff that he says would help to pay for tax cuts if he's reelected. This has been a big debate, as I'm sure you well know, in Washington over the past week or so, and it's about to get a lot louder, making permanent the 2017 tax cuts that are set to expire next year. We saw a new analysis from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget says that would cost in excess of $4 trillion, that it could add that much to our deficit. So if it's not tariffs that offset the cost here, how do you pay for it?
Well, first of all, you got to pay for it with a growing economy that's generating tax proceeds. The best way to do this, and in the Bush, or rather the Trump tax cuts, if President Biden's reelected and those tax cuts are allowed to expire, that's going to hurt all Americans. So if you look at someone who's making $70,000 a year, the impact on them is something like $2,000 of tax reduction benefit that they lose. And this is the thing.
But the impact of inflation is pretty great on a household as well, right? How do you find $4.6 trillion, I think is the number that they put down here, to pay for that without stoking inflation even further?
The inflation's already been stoked by $6 trillion of incremental spending under President Biden.
So you'd add another $4.
No. The primary driver of the inflation we had has been the spending policies of Biden, and Republicans and Democrats have been spending too much. I'm not saying this is solely Democrats, but what's happened under Biden is $6 trillion of spending. And if you think about the types of spending, you can talk about $170 billion of loan forgiveness, which is absolutely, in my opinion, un-American and unfair, or you can talk about tax cuts that are going to benefit all Americans and all Pennsylvanians. And absolutely, inflation is the most regressive tax at all. So we've got to get inflation under control. But the drivers of inflation are bad energy policy that have driven up the prices of fuel and too much spending. And so I would say reversing certainly some of those Biden spending bills and rolling back the war on natural gas and fossil fuels is the key to getting our economy back in check. And I wouldn't, particularly now when so many families are burdened by this inflation, I wouldn't burden them further by rolling back the tax cuts that President Trump put in place.
You can find that full interview with Dave McCormick on the terminal or online. This is Bloomberg TV and radio.
Bob Good has made a lot of enemies in a lot of different sectors.
We're looking forward to seeing John McGuire win next Tuesday. President Trump and I both are looking forward to that.
Trump has taken a special interest in defeating Bob Good.
John is running against Bob Good, who is actually bad for Virginia and who will stab you in the back like he did me.
Bob Good needs to be retired, and John needs to be added to the House of Representatives.
Just a few of the voices commenting on the race for Virginia's 5th congressional district, currently a seat held by Republican Bob Good. But he's being primaried today. Joining us now, our political panel, Sarah Chamberlain, Republican Main Street Partnership President and CEO, whose voice, yes, you did just hear, and Kristen Hahn, Rock Solutions partner. Great to have both of you with us. Of course, Sarah, the Republican Main Street Partnership has a stake in this race. You came out against Bob Good. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling great.
On primary day?
Feeling absolutely wonderful. So I think we'll win probably by about 10 points. We've joined with Trump in this one. A lot of the people are realizing that he is not Trump's pick. That is a Trump district. So we hope to have Bob Good find another job come January.
John McGuire is your candidate here. Yes. Have you learned anything about the Trump effect in this particular race? We've heard about strange bedfellows. I think that's what Mick Mulvaney said a bit about earlier today. You're not typically a MAGA type. You're the mainstream Republican partnership. Is this about the mainstreaming of Donald Trump, or is the broken clock right in this case?
Maybe the broken clock's right a couple of times. But Trump, you have seen, he has endorsed a lot more of the Main Street conservatives this cycle than he did last cycle. So we appreciate that.
Why?
Not directly, but there are certainly people talking with him about this, and we appreciate that. I mean, look what he did in Nevada, look what he did in the Alaska seat. So that's how we keep the majority in the House, and that's how we get the majority in the Senate.
Is hearing that concerning for Democrats, Kristen?
I think it's concerning for our chances of beating some of these people, although I think we have very strong candidates on the Democratic side as well. I think it's healthy for our democracy to have sane, normal people on both sides of the aisle debating, coming together, fighting each other, and may the best man win.
The Vindman race has been interesting to watch here, if only because we live around here. We cannot hide from the commercials. This is Eugene Vindman, the whistleblower in Donald Trump's first impeachment trial, who was on the perfect call. A seat being vacated by Abigail Spanberger. Does he have this sewn up? Because he's raised something like $5 million in a race that's got 6 opponents, or 7 in the field here. That's a lot of money for a congressional district in Virginia.
Yeah, it's a lot of money. I think, when you look at Congresswoman Spanberger, she did everything right. Her teams were on the ground. She ran just impeccable campaigns. And those races weren't easy that's not an easy district for her to win. So, a lot of money is one thing. Yes, I think they have a good operation on the ground. There's a lot of attention being paid to this race. So, yes, I think he can pull it off, but I will be interested to see what the outcome of the primaries are tonight.
I think we're all interested to see the outcome. Certainly the Speaker of the House is, as well, as he's trying to hold on to his majority, Sarah. And he was down at Mar-a-Lago with Donald Trump yesterday. Maybe not coincidentally, we saw a series of True Social endorsements coming off the back of that meeting. What role is the Speaker playing with the former president here as he tries to keep control?
Well, he has been talking with the former president about the candidates that he should be endorsing. We do not want a repeat of what happened 2 years ago. And actually, Richard Hudson, the NRCC chairman, has been down there as well. And again, highlighting the candidates. We need to win these races. We need to keep the House. We need to get the Senate. And we need to do that with Main Street conservatives. And we're pleased that Donald Trump has begun to realize that and has changed from 2 years ago. Because really, it cost us the Senate 2 years ago.
Well, so
candidates
you like
matter.
This image of the Speaker and the former president together at Mar-a-Lago.
Absolutely.
Kevin McCarthy got a lot of criticism for that when he went down after January 6th. When you see an image like that, what does it tell you about the House agenda going forward?
I mean, I think that the leadership is beholden to their candidate. And I mean, Donald Trump is the leader of the Republican Party now.
Does Trump run the House?
He runs the House. I think that we saw that when, members on both sides of the aisle in the Senate were trying to come up with a bipartisan immigration compromise. And, Trump, I have a hard time he even read it or looked at it and just, called the Speaker and said, this isn't good for my reelection. So, you certainly expect that when somebody's at the head of your party. That's who it is right now. So that's, how I feel when I see those types of images.
Well, as we consider what the Republicans are doing with their time. The Democrats today, at least the GCCC, announced a pretty big fundraising haul for May, nearly $12 million, 11.9 to be exact, an all-time fundraising record for the month of May. Kristen, it's pretty early on. Maybe that's why it is a record for the month of May. What do you think is driving it? As we've also seen Trump put up some massive figures for May and heard nothing from the Biden campaign yet.
Yeah, you know what's interesting is that those high numbers, if you look at the individual candidates across the country, are also being reflected in the candidates' races. So I think it's interesting. I think you've got a lot of issues that matter to a lot of people, including, women's health care, abortion. There are a lot of these things that are very personal to people that are driving them to give these sometimes lower dollar increments to the members themselves, and then you're looking at the higher dollar donors when you're looking at the DCCC.
Have we not heard from the Biden campaign or the DNC because that's going to be a disappointing number? Donald Trump made a small fortune following that guilty verdict.
Well, and I think President Biden made a small fortune the other night, with one event. So I wouldn't read too much into it.
Do you expect some sort of a bomb to drop when we hear from the Biden campaign here?
I think Biden hasn't released his numbers because they're going to be much lower than Donald Trump's.
Expect that?
Yeah, I do. Why else would he not release them? If he's higher than Trump, don't you release them and kind of brag a little bit about that?
That's why we ask. Enter George Clooney and Julia Roberts.
Exactly.
Our great panel, Sarah Chamberlain and Kristen Hahn, we thank you so much for the insights today on the campaign trail and beyond. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter if you want to get set for these primary results we've been talking about on the terminal and online.
Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. Enjoy the Juneteenth holiday tomorrow. We'll see you back here on Thursday on Bloomberg TV and radio.